On a cold October morning in 1981, dozens of people gathered outside a farm near Cedar County, Iowa. Most of them had come for the same reason. They wanted to buy a piece of what was left. Some wanted the machinery. Some wanted the livestock. Others wanted the land itself. For the Anderson family, however, there was nothing to gain from being there. The auction wasn't an opportunity. It was the end. After nearly 70 years, the farm that had supported 3 generations of their family was being sold off piece by piece. By noon, strangers would own equipment that Robert Anderson had spent decades maintaining. By evening, someone else would likely own the land his grandfather had cleared by hand. The outcome seemed inevitable, at least until a young mechanic arrived in an aging pickup truck and quietly took his place among the bidders. Few people noticed him. Even fewer took him seriously. But before the day was over, he would force some of the wealthiest investors in the county into a bidding war they never expected. And what happened afterward would become one of the most talked about stories in eastern Iowa for years. To understand how that day unfolded, you first need to understand what the Anderson farm meant to the people who called it home. The Anderson farm began in 1912. That was the year Robert Anderson's grandfather, Samuel, purchased his first 80 acres of Iowa farmland. At the time, the land was far from perfect. Much of it needed clearing. The fences were poor. The buildings were small and weathered. But Samuel saw potential where others saw difficulty. Like many farmers of his generation, he believed that success came through persistence. Year after year, he improved the property. Additional acreage was purchased whenever money allowed. New structures were built. Fields expanded. By the time Samuel passed the farm to his son, it had become a respected operation within the community. His son continued the work. Then eventually, the responsibility passed to Robert Anderson. Robert grew up believing he would spend his entire life on that land. In many ways, he already had. As a child, he followed his father through the fields. As a teenager, he learned to repair machinery. As a young man, he worked from sunrise until dark, helping keep the farm productive. When he eventually married Martha, they built their future around the farm. Neither of them imagined living anywhere else. The farm wasn't merely where they worked. It was where birthdays were celebrated, where family gatherings took place, where children learned responsibility, where generations of memories were made. For decades, life followed a familiar rhythm: planting in spring, growing season through summer, harvest in autumn, maintenance and preparation during winter. There were good years and bad years. But through it all, the farm endured. Then the economy began changing. And suddenly, endurance alone was no longer enough. During the 1970s, many American farmers experienced a period of growth. Crop prices were strong. Land values increased. Banks were willing to lend money. Agricultural experts encouraged expansion. The message seemed clear: grow now, produce more, invest in the future. Like many farmers, Robert followed that advice. He purchased newer equipment, expanded operations, invested in improvements designed to increase productivity. The decision seemed reasonable at the time. The farm needed modern machinery to remain competitive, and as long as prices remained strong, the loans appeared manageable. For several years, things worked. Then conditions shifted. Interest rates began rising sharply. Borrowing became expensive. Fuel costs increased. Equipment repairs became more costly. At the same time, farm income became less predictable. Many farmers suddenly found themselves carrying debt that was becoming harder and harder to repay. Robert was among them. Each season seemed to introduce a new challenge. One year brought poor crop prices. Another brought weather problems. Then came rising operating costs. The profit margins became thinner. Yet the loan payments remained exactly the same. Some nights Robert sat at the kitchen table reviewing numbers long after everyone else had gone to bed. He would study bills, invoices, and loan statements under the glow of a small lamp. Sometimes Martha joined him. Neither spoke much. There wasn't much comfort to be found in the figures. The numbers always seemed to point in the same direction. The farm was earning less while expenses continued rising. Still, Robert believed things could improve. Farmers are optimists by necessity. Every planting season requires faith. Every harvest requires hope. Without those qualities, few people would choose such a demanding life. So Robert continued working, continued believing, continued waiting for better conditions. Unfortunately, conditions only grew worse. The year 1980 proved especially difficult. Spring rains arrived heavily and often. Fields remained muddy longer than expected. Planting was delayed. When conditions finally improved enough to begin work, valuable time had already been lost. Then came a dry summer, not severe enough to destroy everything, but damaging enough to reduce yields significantly. Farmers throughout the region worried constantly. Every week seemed to bring fresh uncertainty. Robert spent countless hours monitoring fields, walking rows, examining crops, trying to estimate what harvest might bring. By autumn, the answer became painfully clear. The numbers would not be enough. Not enough to erase debt. Not enough to catch up on overdue obligations. Not enough to satisfy the bank. The realization hit hard. For months, Robert searched for alternatives. He spoke with lenders, reviewed finances, explored every option available, but each solution seemed temporary. The underlying problem remained. The farm owed more money than it could realistically repay. As winter approached, pressure increased. Letters began arriving more frequently. Phone calls became less friendly. Conversations with lenders grew increasingly serious. Robert understood what was coming long before anyone said it directly. The bank was losing patience, and once a bank decides to protect its investment, farmers often have little room left to negotiate. The letter arrived on a gray February afternoon. Robert found it in the mailbox while returning from town. Even before opening it, he suspected what it contained. The envelope carried the bank's logo. Its weight felt unusually significant. He sat at the kitchen table before opening it. Martha watched quietly from across the room. The silence seemed heavier than usual. Robert unfolded the letter slowly, then read it, then read it again. Neither time did the words change. The bank intended to begin foreclosure proceedings. Unless immediate arrangements could be made, the property would be sold. For several moments, nobody spoke. The kitchen remained completely silent. Outside, a cold wind pushed against the windows. Inside, an entire future seemed to be collapsing. Martha finally broke the silence. "What happens now?" Robert looked down at the letter. The answer was obvious, but saying it aloud made it real. "They're going to auction the farm." The words hung in the air. Neither wanted to hear them. Neither wanted to believe them. Yet there they were, a reality that could no longer be ignored. News traveled quickly through the community. Within days, neighbors had heard. Some stopped by to offer support. Others shared stories of farmers facing similar struggles. Everyone understood how serious the situation had become. Foreclosure auctions were becoming increasingly common across parts of rural America. But that knowledge offered little comfort. The Anderson family wasn't worried about national trends. They were worried about losing their home. And as auction preparations quietly moved forward, another man was hearing their story for the very first time. A young mechanic named Daniel Carter. And unlike everyone else, Daniel wasn't simply listening. He was already beginning to think about what could be done. 22 miles from the Anderson farm, in a small town where nearly everyone knew each other by name, Daniel Carter spent most of his days inside a repair shop. At 27 years old, he had built a reputation as one of the area's most dependable mechanics. Farmers trusted him. If a tractor broke down during planting season, they called Daniel. If a combine failed in the middle of harvest, they called Daniel. If an old machine needed one more year of life squeezed out of it, they called Daniel. He wasn't wealthy, his shop wasn't large, and he certainly wasn't the type of person people expected to see competing against land investors. But Daniel carried a history most people knew little about. When he was 14 years old, his family had lost their farm. The memories remained vivid, even after more than a decade. He remembered the arguments his parents tried to keep hidden, the stack of overdue notices on the kitchen table, the anxious conversations that stopped whenever children entered the room. At first, he hadn't fully understood what was happening. Children rarely do. But as the months passed, the tension became impossible to ignore. Then came the auction. Daniel still remembered that day. The trucks, the strangers, the auctioneer's voice, the feeling of watching people place prices on things that represented his entire childhood. What hurt most wasn't losing machinery. It wasn't losing livestock. It wasn't even losing the house. It was watching his father stand silently as the land was sold. Years of effort disappeared in a matter of minutes. Daniel never forgot the expression on his father's face. Not anger, not bitterness, just heartbreak. That evening, as they loaded the last of their belongings, his father placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember something, son." Daniel looked up. His father stared across the fields one final time. "Land isn't just dirt." At 14, the sentence seemed simple. At 27, Daniel finally understood exactly what it meant. Many people assumed Daniel lived modestly because he had simple tastes. The truth was different. Every decision he made was intentional. While friends bought newer trucks, Daniel continued driving the same aging pickup. While others spent money on entertainment, he worked overtime. Weekend repairs, emergency service calls, long nights in the workshop. Every extra dollar was saved. By 1981, he had accumulated far more money than most people realized. Not enough to make him wealthy, but enough to give him options. Still, nobody knew what those options were. Even Daniel wasn't entirely sure. He simply knew he wanted to be prepared if an opportunity ever came along. An opportunity to do something meaningful. An opportunity connected to the lesson his father had taught him. Years passed without such an opportunity appearing. Then one afternoon, a customer mentioned the Anderson farm. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but it captured Daniel's attention immediately. The customer described the foreclosure, the financial struggles, the upcoming auction. Daniel listened carefully. After the customer left, he found himself thinking about the story. More customers discussed it over the following days. Each conversation revealed another detail, another piece of the puzzle. Eventually, Daniel began asking questions of his own. How much land did the Andersons own? How large was their debt? Who was expected to attend the auction? The more he learned, the more difficult it became to ignore. Because the story sounded painfully familiar. Too familiar. The Anderson family wasn't alone. Throughout Iowa and much of the Midwest, farmers were facing similar struggles. Land values were declining. Interest rates remained painfully high. Many operations that had expanded during better years suddenly found themselves trapped under enormous debt. Communities felt the effects. Local businesses suffered. Equipment dealers struggled. Banks became increasingly cautious. For many rural families, uncertainty became a constant companion. Daniel witnessed the crisis firsthand. Every day, farmers visited his repair shop. Some talked openly about their worries. Others tried to hide them. But the signs were usually obvious. Repairs that once happened immediately were delayed because money was tight. Equipment replacements were postponed. Necessary purchases became difficult decisions. Daniel understood what many of them were experiencing. Because he had seen it before, the faces changed, the circumstances varied slightly, but the underlying story remained remarkably similar. Families worked hard, conditions changed, debt increased, and eventually some lost everything. The Anderson auction seemed destined to become another chapter in that same story. At least, that's what most people believed. Daniel wasn't so sure. Several weeks before the auction, Daniel drove past the Anderson farm, not because he intended to stop, not because he planned to introduce himself. He was simply curious. The property looked much like countless other farms across Iowa, a farmhouse, several barns, equipment sheds, fields stretching toward the horizon. Yet knowing the situation made everything appear different. Daniel slowed his truck. For a moment he considered continuing down the road. Instead, he pulled over. From a distance he watched Robert working near one of the buildings. The farmer moved slowly. Not because he lacked strength, because stress seemed to weigh heavily upon him. Even from afar, Daniel could sense it. The farm appeared quiet. Too quiet, as though everyone was waiting for something they desperately hoped would not arrive. Daniel remained only a few minutes before driving away, but the visit affected him. The situation no longer felt like a story passed between customers. It felt real. The buildings were real. The land was real. The family was real. And suddenly the upcoming auction felt much more personal. As auction day approached, interest in the property increased. Several investors visited the farm. Some came from nearby counties. Others traveled farther. The Anderson land remained attractive despite the circumstances. Good farmland always attracted attention, particularly when financial distress created opportunities for buyers. Rumors spread throughout the community. One investor reportedly planned to add the acreage to an existing operation. Another was believed to be purchasing land strictly as an investment. Others hoped to acquire portions of the property and resell them later. The details varied, but the outcome appeared obvious. Someone with substantial financial resources would purchase the farm. Most local residents accepted this as inevitable. Many sympathized with the Anderson family, yet sympathy could not compete with money, and money was exactly what investors possessed. Daniel heard the same rumors. Unlike most people, however, he paid close attention, particularly to discussions about bidding, expected prices, potential buyers, financial strategies. The information painted a clear picture. Winning the auction would not be easy. If Daniel intended to participate, he would be competing against experienced people accustomed to purchasing land, people who would not hesitate to raise their bids, people who assumed they faced little competition. One evening, Daniel visited his parents. The conversation eventually turned toward farming, then toward foreclosures, then toward the Anderson family. His father listened quietly. Daniel explained everything he had learned: the debt, the auction, the investors. When he finished, the room became silent. His father seemed lost in thought. Finally, he spoke. "You've been thinking about that farm a lot." Daniel nodded. "Maybe." His father smiled slightly. "That's not an answer." Daniel laughed. "No, I guess it isn't." For several moments, neither spoke. Then his father asked a question. "Are you considering bidding?" Daniel looked surprised. "I haven't decided." His father studied him carefully. "That's not what I asked." The old farmer knew his son too well. Daniel eventually nodded. "A little." His father leaned back in his chair, then looked toward the window. For a long moment, he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. "Whatever you decide, make sure you're doing it for the right reasons." Daniel waited. His father continued. "Trying to save everyone isn't possible, I know, but helping one family might be." The words stayed with Daniel long after the conversation ended, because deep down, he already knew what he wanted to do. The real question was whether he had the courage to attempt it. The evening before the auction felt unusually long. Daniel barely slept. He reviewed numbers repeatedly. Savings, available financing, possible bidding limits, potential risks. The calculations were intimidating. One mistake could affect his future for years. Yet every time he considered staying home, he remembered his father's face at that auction long ago. The memory remained powerful. Near midnight, he finally stepped outside. The air was cool, the town was quiet. Above him, the stars stretched across the Iowa sky. Daniel stood there for several minutes, thinking, questioning, wondering whether he was making a mistake. Eventually, he reached a decision. He would attend the auction, not to make a statement, not to attract attention, and certainly not to become a hero. He would attend because sometimes opportunities arrive disguised as difficult choices. And because if he stayed home, he suspected he would regret it for the rest of his life. The next morning, before sunrise, he climbed into his old pickup truck and started the engine. The road ahead was dark. The auction would begin in only a few hours, and by the end of that day, everything would change. The sun had barely risen when vehicles began arriving at the Anderson farm. Pickup trucks rolled slowly down the gravel road. Sedans carrying bankers and investors followed close behind. Neighbors arrived too. Some came out of curiosity. Others came out of respect. Many simply wanted to support the Anderson family during one of the hardest days of their lives. By 8 o'clock, the farmyard was crowded. Groups of people stood talking quietly near the machine shed. Others walked around inspecting equipment that would soon belong to someone else. The atmosphere felt strange, almost uncomfortable. No one needed to be told why. Everyone understood what this day represented. For the buyers, it was an opportunity. For the Anderson family, it was a farewell. Robert woke before dawn. In truth, he had barely slept. He stepped outside and looked across the fields. The same fields he had worked for decades. The same fields his father had worked before him. A thin layer of morning frost covered parts of the ground. The sight was beautiful and heartbreaking. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine that none of this was happening, that it was simply another autumn morning, another ordinary day on the farm. Then he noticed the growing line of vehicles approaching the property. Reality returned. The auction was here, and there was no turning back. Several of the investors were already familiar faces. Some owned large farming operations. Others specialized in purchasing distressed farmland. A few represented investment groups interested in expanding their holdings. Most approached the day as business. Nothing personal, just numbers, acres, potential profit, future value. One investor from a neighboring county spent nearly 30 minutes examining maps of the property. Another walked sections of the land, discussing soil quality with an associate. Their confidence was obvious. Many assumed the auction would proceed exactly as expected. Competition would occur. Prices would rise. Eventually, one of them would win. The Anderson family would leave. Life would move on. None of them expected serious competition from anyone outside their circle. Then, shortly before the auction began, a familiar pickup truck appeared. Daniel Carter had arrived. The old truck rattled slightly as he pulled into a parking area near the barn. He switched off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. His stomach felt tight. His hands felt unusually heavy. He had repaired countless machines under pressure, handled emergencies during harvest, solved difficult problems. Yet somehow this felt different. Because today wasn't about machinery. Today was about people. And unlike engines, people rarely came with instructions. Daniel stepped out and joined the crowd. Few people paid attention. A couple of local farmers nodded in greeting. Most investors barely noticed him. One of them recognized him from previous repair work. "Aren't you the mechanic from Cedar Junction?" Daniel smiled politely. "That's right." The investor laughed. "Didn't expect to see you here." Daniel simply nodded. He wasn't interested in explaining himself. Not yet. The auction began shortly after 9 o'clock. The auctioneer climbed onto a trailer and welcomed everyone. Then the selling started. First came the smaller items: tools, spare parts, shop equipment. One by one, years of accumulated belongings disappeared into the hands of strangers. For the crowd, it was routine. For the Anderson family, every sale carried a memory. That toolbox had belonged to Robert's father. Those welding tools had repaired countless pieces of machinery. That workbench had stood in the same place for decades. The prices didn't matter. The memories did. As the morning continued, larger items followed: a grain wagon, a planter, several tractors, the combine. Each sale seemed to remove another piece of the farm's history. Martha remained remarkably composed, but occasionally her eyes drifted toward the equipment. Daniel noticed. Many others did too. The emotional weight of the day was impossible to ignore. By late morning, much of the machinery had been sold. Now everyone was waiting for the main event: the land. Because no matter how much equipment changed hands, the land remained the true prize. And everyone knew it. The auctioneer paused briefly before announcing the sale of the property. Conversation stopped. The crowd moved closer. Investors straightened their posture. Several removed notepads from their pockets. The atmosphere shifted instantly. This was the moment they had come for. The opening bid was announced. A hand immediately went up. Then another. The bidding moved quickly. Experienced buyers rarely wasted time. The price climbed steadily. The investors appeared confident, relaxed, comfortable, exactly as they expected. Then Daniel raised his hand. At first, few people reacted. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid and continued. Another investor responded. Then Daniel bid again. Several heads turned. A few whispers began moving through the crowd. The mechanic was still participating. Interesting. But surely he wouldn't last long. The bidding continued. The numbers grew larger. One investor withdrew. Then another. Daniel remained. The crowd's curiosity increased. Who exactly was this young man? And more importantly, how far was he willing to go? As the bidding climbed, the atmosphere changed. People who had been casually observing now watched closely. The mechanic was still there, still bidding, still refusing to back down. Each time the auctioneer called for a higher offer, Daniel responded calmly, not aggressively, not dramatically, just confidently. Several investors began studying him carefully. One even approached a local farmer. "What's his story?" The farmer shrugged. "Works on tractors." "That's it, as far as I know." The answer only deepened the mystery, because the numbers were now reaching levels that seemed difficult for an ordinary mechanic to afford. Yet Daniel showed no signs of panic, no signs of hesitation. He had clearly arrived prepared. Meanwhile, Robert Anderson watched from the edge of the crowd. At first, he barely noticed Daniel. Then he realized something unusual was happening. The mechanic kept bidding, again and again and again. Robert didn't know why, but for the first time that day, something unexpected entered his mind. Hope. Small, fragile, but present. Eventually, only 3 bidders remained. A large farming operation from a neighboring county, a wealthy land investor, and Daniel Carter. The crowd had grown completely silent. Every new bid seemed louder than the last. The farmer increased the offer. The investor answered immediately. Daniel followed. Again and again the pattern repeated. The amounts were now far beyond what most people expected. Pressure filled the air. Even the auctioneer seemed surprised. This was becoming one of the most competitive land auctions the area had seen in years. Then the farming operation withdrew. Only 2 bidders remained, the investor and the mechanic. A murmur spread through the crowd. Nobody had expected this. Nobody. The investor adjusted his hat and submitted another bid. Daniel responded. The investor raised it again. Daniel answered once more. The tension became unbearable. The investor paused. He looked toward Daniel. then toward the auctioneer. Finally, he announced another increase, the largest bid of the afternoon. A noticeable reaction moved through the crowd. Many assumed it was over. Surely the mechanic had reached his limit. The amount was substantial. Even experienced buyers seemed impressed. The auctioneer turned toward Daniel. "Do you have another bid?" Silence. A few seconds passed, then a few more. The crowd waited. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. He thought about his father, about the Anderson family, about every reason he had come. Then he slowly raised his hand. The crowd gasped. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid. The investor stared in disbelief. No one spoke. The auctioneer called for another offer. The investor remained silent. The auctioneer called again. Still nothing. One final call. Silence. Then the sound echoed across the property. Sold. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody seemed entirely sure what had just happened. The young mechanic had done the impossible. He had outbid every investor. He now owned the Anderson farm. People immediately surrounded Daniel. Questions came from every direction. What are you going to do with the farm? Are you becoming a farmer? Are you planning to sell it? How long have you been preparing for this? Daniel answered very little. Instead, he asked to speak privately with Robert Anderson. The two men walked away from the crowd. For nearly an hour, they talked. Nobody knew exactly what was said. But several people later remembered seeing tears in Robert's eyes. When the conversation ended, both men returned, and word slowly began spreading through the farmyard. Daniel had no intention of forcing the Anderson family off their land. His goal had never been to remove them. It had never been about profit. Instead, he wanted to create a path that would allow the family to remain connected to the farm while rebuilding their future. The details would take time. Nothing could erase the financial damage overnight. But for the first time in months, the Anderson family had options. Real options. And that changed everything. Years later, people still talked about that auction. Not because a mechanic became a landowner, not because investors lost, but because of what happened afterward. In a period when rural communities were struggling, people needed reminders that kindness still existed, that not every decision was driven by profit, that ordinary individuals could still make extraordinary choices. Daniel Carter never considered himself a hero. He simply remembered what it felt like to watch a family lose everything. And when he had the opportunity to help another family avoid that pain, he acted. The auction became part of local history, a story passed between neighbors, shared at coffee shops, remembered at community gatherings, a reminder that sometimes the most important victories aren't measured in dollars. They're measured in the lives we choose to impact. And on that cold Iowa morning in 1981, one young mechanic changed far more than the outcome of an auction. He changed the ending of a family's story.